December 1944, Stalag 9B, Bad Orb, Germany. The snow fell thick and heavy over the camp, muffling the sound of boots on frozen ground. Inside the barbed wire fences, a column of exhausted American prisoners stumbled forward, some still bleeding, others too numb to feel anything at all. At the gate, a German guard straightened his posture. His orders were clear: separate the prisoners by race. White soldiers to the main compound. Black soldiers to the segregated barracks, reduce rations, no Red Cross parcels, no correspondence. It was the Nazi system, but with an American twist. The Wehrmacht had learned of racial segregation directly from their enemy's own army. If the Americans themselves divided soldiers by skin color, surely the logic went those divisions were justified. The German command viewed segregation not as cruelty, but as mimicry of American policy. The guard approached a group of black prisoners, ready to bark commands in harsh German. He expected confusion, the blank stares of men who didn't understand a word. He prepared to shout, to shove. But before he could speak, one of the prisoners looked up, his back straight, eyes sharp, and said in perfect Bavarian accented German, "Guten Morgen, Herr Feldwebel. We understand your orders perfectly. Would you prefer we form ranks by height or by unit?" The guard froze. The words, the accent, flawless. Behind the speaker, rows of disciplined black soldiers stood motionless, perfectly aligned. Their posture, their tone, unmistakably military. The propaganda had said these men were uneducated laborers, not soldiers. The reality stood right before him, educated, disciplined, and fluent in the enemy's tongue. It was a moment of rupture, the first crack in a worldview built on lies. Over the following weeks, German guards across multiple POW camps would experience that same shock again and again. The Nazi racial order collided head-on with living evidence that refuted it. Records show that some of the captured black soldiers were college-educated, multilingual, and technically skilled. They'd come from units like the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, transportation, and engineer regiments. Men trained not only in combat, but in mathematics, mechanics, and communications. They'd been segregated not for lack of skill, but because of American racism. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, it threw tens of thousands of Allied troops into chaos. In the Ardennes forests, more than 23,000 Americans were captured in the German counteroffensive, among them hundreds of black soldiers from support and artillery units suddenly thrust into the front lines. For the Wehrmacht, it was the first large-scale encounter with African-American combat troops. At first, they didn't know what to make of them. Standard interrogation procedures developed under racial assumptions presumed these prisoners would be illiterate or poorly trained. Translators weren't even prepared to speak with them. But almost immediately, the old expectations collapsed. A German intelligence officer recorded in his diary, "The Negro prisoners astonish me. One speaks German as though raised in Munich." Another quotes Schiller, "These are not the ignorant men our doctrine describes." What the Germans failed to realize was that many of these soldiers had studied languages, engineering, or literature before the war. Some had been teachers, mechanics, and linguists. Several were graduates of Tuskegee Institute and other historically black colleges institutions that had trained an entire generation of African Americans who were determined to prove their worth in a nation that refused to see it. During interrogations, these prisoners shocked their captors by switching effortlessly between English, French, and German, sometimes correcting the officer's grammar. The guards, many of them trained in Hitler Youth ideology, didn't know how to respond. They'd been taught that black men were biologically inferior, yet here they stood, debating German literature and military theory. One Wehrmacht report, later recovered from the archives, described the contradiction with bureaucratic understatement. Prisoner exhibits education level superior to many German officers. Speaks High German fluently. Previous assumptions regarding Negro intellectual capacity require revision. That revision, however, came slowly and painfully. The German state had built its entire war machine on pseudoscience, on the belief that superiority could be measured by race. And now, inside the very camps that embodied that ideology, the evidence was breaking through the walls. Black POWs proved not only capable, but essential. Many could read German military orders directly, translate them for fellow prisoners, and interpret guard instructions without assistance. Others used their engineering knowledge to repair equipment, manage logistics, or even advise on construction. This didn't sit well with the camp commandants. For officers raised under Nazi racial hierarchy, the notion of a black prisoner issuing technical explanations to a German engineer was intolerable. And yet, practicality forced their hand. The Wehrmacht was desperate. Its army was crumbling, its manpower depleted. Efficiency mattered more than ideology, at least on the ground. And so, in camps like Stalag 9B, an uneasy contradiction emerged. The same prisoners declared inferior by doctrine became indispensable to daily operations. Guards who once spat racial slurs found themselves depending on these men for order, communication, and even mechanical maintenance. Still, not all Germans could reconcile what they witnessed. Some guards, especially older veterans of World War I, saw through the propaganda. Their private diaries, recovered after the war, reveal moments of dawning awareness. The American Negro prisoners are not as we were told. They are disciplined, proud, and educated. How could we have been so wrong? Others clung to ideology with white-knuckled denial. They insisted these men must be exceptions, mixed race, or European trained. The alternative, that Nazi racial theory itself was wrong, was too dangerous to admit, even to themselves. What unfolded inside those wire fences wasn't merely a clash of armies. It was a collision of worldviews between the propaganda of racial hierarchy and the reality of human capability. In a bitter twist of irony, the black soldiers of the U.S. Army men, segregated by their own government, denied equal rations and promotions, became living evidence against the very ideology of their captors. And the German guards, watching them march, translate, and survive with quiet dignity, began to see something they were never meant to see. That intelligence and discipline know no color. The stage was set for a confrontation deeper than any battle one fought, not with guns or tanks, but with language, knowledge, and the unshakable proof of humanity. By early 1945, as the snow melted into mud across central Germany, the contradictions inside POW camps grew impossible to ignore. The Wehrmacht's propaganda had painted a world divided into pure and impure, superior and subhuman. Yet each passing day, the guards found that reality did not obey ideology. The black American prisoners, once labeled as labor stock, began to prove invaluable in ways the Germans never predicted. Some were fluent not only in German, but also in French, Italian, and Dutch, products of university education or service in Europe before the war. Others had worked as mechanics, teachers, or engineers. Their quiet competence became both their weapon and their shield. At Stalag 9B, where food was scarce and morale lower than the temperature, the German guards soon realized they needed interpreters. Orders shouted in broken English caused confusion among the prisoners, risking chaos. The logical choice was to recruit from the white American ranks. But to their astonishment, the best translators, the ones who understood military terms, logistics, and discipline, came from the very group they'd been taught to despise. And so, reluctantly, the camp commandant allowed black prisoners to serve as intermediaries, translating, organizing work details, and conveying German orders to fellow inmates. It was a small administrative decision, but it turned ideology on its head. Within weeks, black POWs were managing aspects of camp operation, issuing instructions, and correcting German paperwork errors. In a system obsessed with racial hierarchy, this inversion was nothing short of heresy. One German sergeant reportedly complained, "The Negro prisoners obey discipline better than our own recruits. They follow orders exactly, perhaps because they understand them better." For the prisoners, this uneasy authority became a means of survival. Every word they spoke, every interaction with a guard, carried the weight of risk. They knew that any sign of defiance could mean a beating or worse. But they also knew that respect, precision, and intelligence could buy small but vital concessions. A loaf of bread, an extra blanket, a postponed punishment. Food was the sharpest weapon in the Germans' arsenal. Under Nazi policy, black prisoners received reduced rations, half portions, sometimes less justified by the chilling logic that America itself segregated its troops. If the United States viewed black soldiers as inferior, German administrators argued they were simply following the Americans' own precedent. In the winter of 1944-45, starvation was everywhere. Germany itself was starving. Yet, within the camps, the difference between life and death often hinged on a single bowl of soup or a crust of bread. For black POWs, those rations were cut further, a punishment disguised as policy. That's when language became a weapon. Fluent German speakers among the black prisoners began to challenge their captors using the Germans' own bureaucracy. They cited Geneva Convention articles, corrected misquoted orders, and argued that reduced rations violated international law. Their protests rarely changed policy, but they changed people. A guard confronted in his own language could no longer hide behind ignorance. When a prisoner spoke to him with formal grammar, military courtesy, and legal precision, something shifted. The facade of superiority cracked. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, that crack opened into conscience. There are records fragments from post-war testimonies of guards who quietly slipped food to prisoners after such exchanges. One wrote in his diary, "They spoke to me not as slaves, but as soldiers. They reminded me of honor. I had forgotten what that meant." Beyond the fences, the war was collapsing. Allied bombers roared overhead daily. The front was disintegrating, and Germany's infrastructure was in ruins. Inside the camps, guards feared retaliation from the prisoners once defeat came. Yet among the black POWs, discipline held. Many had learned from bitter experience that survival required restraint, not revenge. Still, the camps became a strange theater of moral inversion. In workshops attached to POW compounds, the Germans exploited prisoners as forced labor, repairing vehicles, machinery, and radio equipment, all in violation of the Geneva Convention. The Nazis justified it as necessary for maintenance. But again, the irony was brutal. Many of the prisoners forced into these jobs were engineers, mechanics, and technicians, men whose expertise had been dismissed as impossible for their race. A sergeant from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion later recalled, "They needed us to fix things, engines, tools, even their own heating systems. We made ourselves useful, but never too useful. We fixed what kept us alive, not what kept them fighting." Survival required cunning. The prisoners worked deliberately, slowly, subtly, sabotaging repairs, miscalibrating machinery just enough to pass inspection but fail under pressure. They used their technical knowledge not just to live, but to quietly resist. As the weeks dragged on, relationships between guards and prisoners grew complex. Some hardened in their hatred, clinging to ideology like a lifeline in a collapsing world. Others, older veterans who'd seen the First World War, found themselves unexpectedly moved by the prisoners' conduct. The educated black POWs didn't just speak German, they spoke of German culture, quoting Goethe, Schiller, or discussing Prussian military history. They referenced battles from 1870 or the tactics of Clausewitz. To guards who had grown up revering these traditions before Hitler twisted them, such conversations cut deep.
He said you need
A
to
prisoner
stay
might
warm
say quietly,
and try to
"Clausewitz
drink
taught
this
that the
broth.
true soldier respects the enemy
Just
who
a
fights
little
with
bit
honor."
at a time.
For a German officer, hearing that from a man his government called inferior was disarming. It didn't erase prejudice overnight, but it humanized the enemy. And in the machinery of genocide and dehumanization that defined Nazi Germany, that was an act of rebellion all its own. By February 1945, the situation had become desperate. German supply lines were collapsing. POW camps were overcrowded, freezing, and diseased. The guards knew the war was lost. The only question was how long they could delay the inevitable. For the prisoners, knowledge was power. Those who understood German could overhear conversations, whispers about approaching Allied armies, about evacuations, about orders to march prisoners deeper into Germany to prevent their liberation. For many, this intelligence meant survival. They could prepare, hide, or escape when the time came. And yet, through all the hunger and brutality, a strange and quiet truth emerged that the prisoners who had been denied equality in their own army were now living proof of the very thing the Nazis denied: the universality of human intellect and dignity. In the cold heart of enemy territory, they became the unintentional teachers, showing their captors that the categories of race and hierarchy were illusions. By March 1945, the war had entered its death throes. The Reich was collapsing from within, and the front lines were closing in. Yet inside the POW camps scattered across Germany, the ideological war, the one between racial fantasy and human reality, was reaching its most profound confrontation. German guards had stopped pretending that their prisoners were what propaganda described. They'd seen too much. The American black soldiers were not broken men of limited understanding. They were teachers, linguists, engineers, scholars. Their quiet intellect had become undeniable, their discipline unshakable. Still, the system itself refused to bend. The SS and Gestapo, desperate to preserve the illusion of Aryan supremacy, doubled down on denial. When reports surfaced about educated black prisoners who spoke German or possessed advanced technical knowledge, the official line was predictable: exceptions, mixed race. Educated in Europe, anything but the truth that the ideology itself was wrong. But the guards who lived among these men could not ignore reality. Diaries recovered after the war reveal a haunting transformation. In December 1944, a young sergeant wrote, "The Negroes stare blankly. They do not speak German. They are animals." By March 1945, the same man's tone had changed. "They are intelligent, disciplined soldiers. Some speak better German than I do. I can no longer believe what we were told." That transformation was dangerous. It wasn't just political, it was psychological. To admit that Nazi racial theory was wrong was to admit that the foundation of the war itself was rotten. But truth, once seen, cannot easily be unseen. The educated black prisoners, particularly those fluent in German, used their knowledge strategically. They learned to quote Wehrmacht regulations, to invoke Clause 9 of the Geneva Convention, to appeal to the guards' own sense of order and professionalism. When a guard overstepped his authority or attempted punishment without command approval, a prisoner might respond in formal, precise German. According to Wehrmacht protocol, such actions require a commandant's signature. You risk your rank if you proceed. For the guards, this was disorienting. To be corrected in their own language by a man they were taught to see as inferior was more than an embarrassment, it was a crack in the ideological armor. There are recorded incidents of guards hesitating mid-beating, stepping back and quietly muttering, "Go back to your quarters." That hesitation saved lives. Other prisoners learned to navigate German bureaucracy with startling efficiency. They filled out paperwork, translated letters, handled supply lists, all tasks that required trust and precision. Slowly, a strange inversion of power took shape. The very men the Nazis deemed unfit for equality became indispensable to maintaining order in their own captivity. Intelligence officers began to take notice. A classified Wehrmacht report dated February 1945 stated, "Continued interaction with Negro prisoners reveals intelligence and discipline indistinguishable from that of white soldiers. Prior racial assessments must be reconsidered." The report never reached high command. It was buried labeled politically dangerous. Yet the truth had already spread through whispers and personal accounts among the ranks. In several camps, guards started to rely on these educated black prisoners for more than translation. They asked questions about America, about the war, even about race itself. One German lieutenant, in a post-war interrogation, admitted, "I had never spoken to a Negro before. They were polite, even noble. I realized we had been lied to. Our schools, our newspapers, everything." For men raised in a system where ideology was as sacred as religion, such realization was nothing short of blasphemy. But it planted seeds that would outlive the war. Meanwhile, for the prisoners, survival still depended on strategy. Language and education could protect them, but not always. In some camps, SS officers insisted that racial classifications dictated treatment. Rations were still cut, beatings still happened, medical care was still denied. Yet those same language skills often became lifelines. When rations were short, a German-speaking prisoner might negotiate directly with the kitchen staff, arguing that a group's assigned bread weight was miscalculated. When disease spread, they translated medical orders, ensuring that infected prisoners weren't ignored. Some even found ways to exploit the Germans' obsession with documentation, writing their own transfer requests, adjusting labor assignments, and quietly protecting weaker comrades. They used the bureaucracy of their captors as both armor and weapon. This survival wasn't passive endurance, it was tactical resistance through intellect. Each day became an act of quiet defiance, a negotiation for dignity, a performance of composure under dehumanization. There were moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when the line between prisoner and guard blurred. Older German veterans, especially those who'd served before Hitler's rise, sometimes spoke to the prisoners as men rather than subjects. They'd sit by the fence and talk about the trenches of 1918, about music, about the futility of war. One such exchange, recorded in a 1946 American debriefing, described a German guard sharing his last cigarette with a black prisoner. The guard confessed, "We were told your kind were savages, but you speak Goethe, you fix engines, you fight like soldiers. Perhaps we are the savages." Not all guards changed. Many remained fanatics to the end, their hatred hardening as Germany fell apart. But even among those, the seeds of doubt had been sown. As Allied forces advanced and rumors of liberation spread, the Guards' fear grew. They knew what they had done.
Another mystery.
Yet, in several
filed
camps,
away.
those same black prisoners,
Perhaps
despite
never to
starvation
see
and
the
abuse,
light of day
maintained
again.
discipline. They didn't riot. They didn't seek revenge. They waited, knowing that survival was the ultimate victory. When liberation finally came in the spring of 1945, the gates of Stalag IXB and other camps swung open to reveal a truth that stunned the liberators. The surviving black POWs were gaunt, frostbitten, and scarred but organized. They'd maintained internal systems of order and communication under impossible conditions. German guards, in turn, faced an even deeper reckoning. Some openly apologized, others simply stared at the ground, unable to reconcile what they had seen with what they'd believed. One American officer who entered the camp recorded, "It was the strangest thing. The German guards seemed ashamed not merely of their defeat, but of what these men had proven about them. For a few, that shame would transform into something else: recognition." In post-war Germany, former guards who'd witnessed these prisoners' intelligence and dignity became some of the earliest voices to reject racial theory. They had learned through direct experience that the Nazi worldview was not just immoral, it was false. But for the black soldiers who had endured that captivity, liberation was not the end of their struggle. It was merely a return to another system of segregation, one that awaited them not in Germany, but at home. When the gates of Stalag 9B finally swung open, the air was still heavy with the smell of decay and cold steel. Liberation did not come as a triumphant moment of joy, it came as a slow, exhausted realization that survival itself was the victory. The black American prisoners who stumbled into the light of freedom carried with them the scars of starvation, disease, and humiliation, but also something more profound: the unshakable proof that human worth cannot be defined by skin. As Allied troops surveyed the camp, they were stunned by what they found. In the records, the German officers had documented everything, every order, every ration, every punishment. But buried among those bureaucratic notes were contradictions. Memos acknowledging that some of the Negro prisoners had performed essential administrative work, that they spoke fluent German, that they had maintained discipline even as the guards collapsed into despair. The paperwork of oppression had inadvertently preserved its own undoing. Several American officers noted that the German guards, now themselves prisoners, seemed uneasy in the presence of the men they had once deemed inferior. In the chaos of surrender, one U.S. interrogator reported a guard whispering, "They were not what we were told. They were better soldiers than we were." The irony was staggering. These black soldiers, segregated by their own army, denied promotions, given hand-me-down uniforms, had dismantled the myth of racial superiority not through ideology or protest, but through quiet excellence. Their intellect and discipline had survived where ideology had failed. And yet, their victory was bittersweet. When they returned home, many of these men found that the same nation they had fought for was unprepared to recognize their heroism. They came back to a segregated America, where restaurants, schools, and even the Veterans Administration hospitals were divided by race. Some tried to tell their stories, but few wanted to listen. The American public, still clinging to its own racial hierarchies, wasn't ready to confront the uncomfortable parallel between Nazi ideology and its domestic reflection. The government celebrated the heroism of the greatest generation, but the contributions of black soldiers, especially those captured and abused in enemy camps, were buried under silence. Historians later discovered that many of these soldiers were never officially recorded as POWs at all. Their files were incomplete, lost, or deliberately neglected. Some were denied full military honors, their testimonies disregarded. They had survived two systems of racism, one defeated abroad, the other alive at home. For the German guards, the aftermath was equally complex.
We did our duty.
Some of those who had interacted daily with the educated black prisoners underwent quiet transformations. They had witnessed a reality that propaganda could not erase. They'd seen discipline without hatred, dignity under duress, and intellect in the faces of men their ideology called subhuman. One former Wehrmacht corporal, interviewed in 1952, admitted, "It changed me completely. I was a believer until I saw them. We were told that intelligence was blood, that culture was race. But I saw men who had nothing, who spoke our language, quoted our poets, fixed our machines, and still treated us like human beings. After that, I could never believe again." Others could not bear the contradiction. They clung to their prejudice, rewriting the memory into lies. Some insisted those prisoners must have been exceptional hybrids, educated by white Americans. Others blamed Jewish propaganda, but among the ruins of Germany, the myth of racial superiority had been exposed as a hollow mask. Meanwhile, in the United States, the same soldiers who had survived Nazi captivity now faced segregation in uniform. The Tuskegee Airmen returned from flying combat missions in Europe only to be denied service in white officers' clubs. Infantrymen from the 92nd Division were treated as second-class veterans. Men who had spoken Goethe and quoted Schiller to Nazi guards were barred from attending white universities under the GI Bill. It was a cruel symmetry. In Germany, their intelligence had broken the enemy's ideology. In America, that same intelligence was met with silence. But the experience had changed them. Many became outspoken advocates for civil rights, quietly planting the seeds of a movement that would erupt a decade later. Some became teachers, writers, and community leaders, sharing their wartime stories as testimony against both fascism and segregation. One former prisoner years later told an interviewer, "When I spoke German in that camp, I wasn't just speaking to them, I was speaking to the lie that said I didn't belong. I was proving that knowledge has no color and that dignity doesn't need permission." The post-war archives reveal another layer of irony. In several occupied zones, former German guards who had renounced Nazi ideology went on to become part of West Germany's reconstruction, its new police, bureaucrats, teachers. Some corresponded with the very prisoners they once guarded, sending letters of apology decades later. One such letter, preserved in the U.S. Army War Records, reads, "You spoke to me in my own tongue, and I was ashamed. You were my prisoner, yet I learned from you. I hope your country one day gives you the respect I could not." That respect was slow to come, but history, like truth, has a way of resurfacing. In the 1,990 seconds, historians revisiting wartime documents uncovered dozens of testimonies from German officers acknowledging the intellectual and moral strength of their black captives. These reports, once suppressed for political reasons, became powerful evidence that Nazi racial ideology had failed the ultimate test: contact with reality. The lessons of Stalag 9B and other camps were not just about war, they were about perception. The German guards learned that intelligence and humanity cannot be categorized by blood. The black prisoners learned that even in captivity, knowledge and composure were forms of power that no oppressor could strip away. Together, these two truths collided in one of history's darkest places and produced something almost miraculous: understanding. In the words of one survivor, decades later, "We didn't fight them with guns, we fought them with truth, and for some of them, that was harder to survive than the war." Their story is not merely an episode of forgotten military history. It is a mirror, one that reflects how ideologies built on hatred crumble when confronted by dignity, intellect, and courage. These men did not set out to teach lessons about equality, they simply lived as proof of it. And for the guards who once believed the lie, that proof was unforgettable.